again. Welcome to Little House Live. No, that is not a COVID cough. Welcome to Little House Live Day 30. Pardon me. I don't know why I don't know why I'm yawning. I have been in bed in the last 48 hours. I've probably been in bed like 35. You'll hear it all on the tea break tomorrow. How's everybody doing? I know there's only two of us here, but we're going to do our best to read 2 chapters today. I know I look cute and perky. I'm still not well, but I'm going to do this, right? We're going to do this together. So, welcome to Little House Live, Day 30, Chapter 12, Fresh Water to Drink. Now, remember, this book is mostly fiction or stories that Laura heard as a child, because when they were actually in Indian territory, while a lot of this stuff was going on, she was actually a toddler. She was like 18 months old. All right. Fresh water to drink. Pa had made the bedstead. He had smoothed the oak slabs till there was not a splinter on them, and then he pegged them firmly together. 4 slabs made a box to hold the straw tick. Across the bottom of it, Pa stretched a rope, zigzag from side to side, and pulled tight. On the end of the bedstead, Pa pegged solidly to the wall in a corner of the house. Only one corner of the bed was not against the wall, or a wall. At this corner, Pa set up a tall slab. He pegged it to the bedstead, as high as he could reach. He pegged 2 strips of oak to the walls and to the tall slab. Then he climbed up on them and pegged the top of the tall slab solidly to a rafter. And on the strips of oak, he laid a shelf above the bed. "There you are, Caroline," he said. "I can't wait to see it made up," said Ma. "I can't wait to see it made up," said Ma. "Help me bring in the straw tick." She filled the straw tick that morning. There was no straw on the high prairie, so she filled it with dry, clean, dead grass. It was hot from the sunshine, and it had a grassy, sweet smell. Pa helped her bring it into the house and lay it in the bedstead. She tucked the sheets in and spread her prettiest patchwork quilt over them. At the head of the bed, she set up the goose feather pillows and spread the pillow shams against them. On each white pillow sham, 2 little birds were outlined with red thread. Then Ma and Pa and Laura and Mary stood and looked at the bed. It was a very nice bed. The zigzag rope was softer than the floor to sleep on. The straw tick was plump with the sweet-smelling grass. The quilt lay smooth, and the pretty pillow shams stood up crisply. The shelf was a good place to store things. The whole house had quite an air with such a bed in it. That night, when Ma went to bed, she settled into the crackling straw tick and said to Pa, "I declare, I'm so comfortable it's almost sinful." Mary and Laura still slept on the floor, but Pa would make a little bed for them as soon as he could. He had made the big bed, and he had made a stout cupboard and padlocked it, so the Indians could not take all the cornmeal if they came again. Now he had only to dig a well, and then he would make that trip to town. He must dig the well first so that Ma could have water while he was gone. Next morning, he marked a large circle in the grass near the corner of the house. With his spade, he dug the sod. He cut the sod inside the circle and lifted it up in large pieces. Then he began to shovel out the earth, digging himself deeper and deeper down. Mary and Laura must not go near the well while Pa was digging. Even when they couldn't see his head any more, shovelfuls of earth came flying up. At last the spade flew up and fell into the grass. Then Pa jumped. His hands caught hold of the sod, and one elbow gripped it, and then the other elbow. And with a heave, Pa came rolling out. "I can't throw the dirt out any deeper," he said. He had to have help now. So he took his gun and rode away on Paddy. When he came back, He brought a plump rabbit, and he had traded work with Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott would help him dig his well, and then he would help Mr. Scott dig his well. And then he would help dig Mr. Scott's well, excuse me. Ma and Laura and Mary had not seen Mr. and Mrs. Scott. Their house was hidden somewhere in a little valley on the prairie. Ma had seen the smoke rising from it, and that was all. At sunup the next morning, Mr. Scott came. He was short and stout. His hair was bleached by the sun, and his skin was bright red and scaly. He did not tan, he peeled. "It's this blasted sun and wind," he said. "Beg your pardon, ma'am, but it's enough to make a saint use strong language. I might as well be a snake the way I keep on shedding my skin in this country." Laura liked him. Every morning, as soon as the dishes were washed and the beds made, she ran out to watch Mr. Scott and Pa working at the well. The sunshine was blistering, even the winds were hot, and the prairie grasses were turning yellow. Mary preferred to stay in the house and sew on her patchwork quilt, but Laura liked the fierce light and the sun and the wind, and she couldn't stay away from the well, but she was not allowed to go near its edge. Pa and Mr. Scott had made a stout windlass. It stood over the well, and 2 buckets hung from it on the ends of a rope. When the windlass was turned, 1 bucket went down into the well, and the other bucket came up. In the morning, Mr. Scott slid down the rope and dug. He filled the buckets with earth almost as fast as Pa could haul them up and empty them. After dinner, Pa slid down the rope into the well, and Mr. Scott hauled up the buckets. Every morning, before Pa would let Mr. Scott go down the rope, he set a candle in a bucket and lighted it and lowered it to the bottom. Once Laura peeped over the edge, and she saw the candle burning brightly far down in the hole in the ground. Then Pa would say, "Seems to be all right," and he would pull up the bucket and blow out the candle. "That's all foolishness, Ingalls," Mr. Scott said. "The well was all right yesterday." "You can't ever tell," Pa replied. "Better be safe than sorry." Laura did not know what danger Pa was looking for by that candlelight. She did not ask because Pa and Mr. Scott were busy. She meant to ask later, but she forgot. One morning, Mr. Scott came while Pa was eating breakfast. He heard him shout, "Hi, Ingalls, it's sunup, let's go." Pa drank his coffee and went out. The windlass began to creak, and Pa began to whistle. Laura and Mary were washing the dishes, and Ma was making the big bed when Pa's whistling stopped. He heard him say, "Scott!" He shouted, "Scott, Scott!" Then he called, "Carolyn, come quick." Ma ran out of the house. Laura ran after her. "Scott's fainted or something down there. I've got to go down after him." "Did you send down the candle, Ma?" Ma asked. "No, I thought he had. I asked him if it was all right, and he said it was." Pa cut the empty bucket off the rope and tied the rope firmly to the windlass. "Charles, you mustn't," Ma said. "Caroline, I've got to." "You can't." "Oh, sorry. I'll make it all right. I won't breathe till I get out. We can't let him die down there." Ma said fiercely, "Laura, keep back." So Laura kept back. She stood against the house and shivered. No, Charles, I can't let you," Ma said. "Get on Patty and go for help." "There isn't time." "Charles, if I can't pull you up, if you keel over down there, I can't pull you up." "Caroline, I've got to," Pa said as he swung into the well. His head slid out of sight down the rope. Ma crouched and shaded her eyes, staring down into the well. All over the prairie, meadowlarks were rising, singing, flying straight up into the sky. The wind was blowing warmer, but Laura was cold. Suddenly, Ma jumped up and seized the handle of the windlass. She tugged at it with all her might. The rope strained and the windlass creaked. Laura thought that Pa had keeled over down in the dark bottom of the well, and Ma couldn't pull him up. Excuse me. But the windlass turned a little and then a little more. Pa's hand came up, holding to the rope. His other hand reached above it and took hold of the rope. Then Pa's head came up. His arm held on to the windlass. Then somehow he got to the ground and sat there. The windlass whirled round and round again, and there was a thud deep down in the well. Pa struggled to get up, and Ma said, "Sit still, Charles. Laura, get some water. Quick." Laura ran. She came hurrying back, lugging the pail of water. Pa and Ma were both turning the windlass. The rope slowly wound itself up. The bucket came up out of the well, and tied to the bucket and the rope was Mr. Scott. His arms and legs and head hung and wobbled. His mouth was partly open and his eyes half shut. Pa tugged him onto the grass. Pa rolled him over and he flopped where he was rolled. Pa felt his wrist and listened to his chest, and then Pa lay down beside him. "He's breathing," Pa said. "He'll be all right in the air." "I'm all right, Caroline. I'm plumb tuckered out is all." "Well," scolded Mother. "Well," Ma scolded. "I should think you would be. Of all the senseless performances, my goodness gracious, scaring a body to death, all for the want of a little reasonable care. My goodness, She covered her face with her apron and burst out crying. That was a terrible day. "I don't want a well," Ma sobbed. "It isn't worth it. I won't have you taking such risks." Mr. Scott had breathed a kind of gas that stays deep in the ground. It stays at the bottom of wells because it's heavier than air. It cannot be seen or smelled, but no one can breathe it very long and live. Pa had gone down into that gas to tie Mr. Scott to the rope so that he could be pulled up out of the gas. When Mr. Scott was able, he went home. Before he went, he said to Pa, "You were right about that candle business, Ingalls. I thought it was all foolishness, and I would not bother with it, but I found my mistake." "Well," said Pa, "where a light can't live, I know I can't. And I like to be safe when I can. But all's well that ends well." Pa rested a while. He had breathed a little bit of the gas and felt like resting. But that afternoon, he raveled a thread from a tow sack, and he took a little powder from his powder horn. He tied the powder in a little piece of cloth with one end of the tow string in the powder. "Come along, Laura, and I'll show you something." Pa went to the well. Pa lighted the end of the string and waited till the spark was crawling quickly along it. Then he dropped the little bundle into the well. In a minute, they heard a muffled bang, and a puff of smoke came out of the well. "That will bring the gas," Pa said. When the smoke was all gone, he let Laura light the candle and stand beside him while he let it go down. All the way down into the dark hole, the little candle kept on burning like a star. So the next day, Pa and Mr. Scott went on digging the well, but they always sent the candle down every morning. There began to be a little water in the well, but it was not enough. The buckets came up full of mud, and Pa and Mr. Scott worked every day in deeper mud. In the morning, when the candle went down, it lighted oozy wet walls, and the candlelight sparkled in rings over the water when the bucket struck bottom. Pa stood knee-deep in water and bailed out buckets full before he could begin digging in the mud. One day, when he was digging, a shout came echoing up. Ma ran out of the house and Laura ran to the well. "Pull, Scott, pull!" Pa yelled. A swishing, gurgling sound echoed down in there. Mr. Scott turned the windlass as fast as he could, and Pa came up, climbing hand over hand up the rope. Blamed if that's not quicksand, Pa gasped as he stepped onto the ground and muddy and dripping. I was pushing down hard on the spade when all of a sudden it went down, the whole length of the handle, and water came pouring up all around me. A good 6 feet of this rope's wet, Mr. Scott said, winding it up. The bucket was full of water. You've showed sense in getting out of that hand over hand, Ingalls. That water came up faster than I could pull you out. Then Mr. Scott slapped his thigh and shouted, And I'm blasted if you didn't bring up the spade. Sure enough, Pa had saved his spade. In a little while, the well was almost full of water. A circle of blue sky lay not far down in the ground. And when Laura looked at it, a little girl's head looked up at her. When she waved her hand, a hand on the water surface waved too. The water was clear and cold and good. Laura thought that she had never tasted anything so good as those long, cold drinks of water. Pa hauled no more stale, warm water from the creek. He built a solid platform over the well and a heavy cover for the hole that let the water bucket through. Laura must never touch that cover. But whenever she or Mary was thirsty, Ma lifted the cover and drew up a dripping bucket of cold, fresh water from the well. How's everybody doing? What's going on? Hey, Joe Mama, let me say hi to everybody. Let me say hi. Now that Joe Mama and Sherry Leach, I thought I saw more people than that. 1927, haven't seen her TikTok. I'll check it out. Sage advice. Where light can't live, neither can I. Guess what? That's why we push back at the darkness every day, right? So do we want to read one more chapter? Hey, Martha Holcomb, how's it going? Do we want to read one more chapter? It's another fairly long one. Excuse me. I'm looking for a vote. Yes or no? If I see no, or if I don't see any yeses at all, then I'm going to quit for the day. Okay. You got in just in time, Sherry. All right. Chapter 13. Texas Longhorns. One evening, Laura and Pa were sitting on the doorstep. The moon shone over the dark prairie, and the winds were still, and softly Pa played his fiddle. Not much, Joe Mama, but I'm working on it. He let a last note quiver far, far away until it dissolved into the moonlight. Everything was so beautiful that Laura wanted it to stay so forever. But Pa said it was time for little girls to go to bed. Then Laura heard a strange, low, distant sound. What's that? She said. Pa listened. Cattle, by George, he said. Must be cattle herds going north to Fort Dodge. After she was undressed, Laura stood in her nightgown at the window. The air was still, not a blade of grass rustled, and far away and faint she could hear that sound. It was almost a rumble and almost a song. Is that singing, Pa? Yes, Pa said. The cowboys are singing the cattle to sleep. Now hop into bed, you little scallywag. Laura thought of cattle lying on the dark ground in the moonlight and of cowboys softly singing lullabies. Next morning, when she ran out of the house, two strange men were sitting on horses by the stable. Okay, hang on a second, folks. I forgot I was not on Do Not Disturb. There we go. That was my daughter-in-law. I'll call her after. Where were we? The next morning when she ran out of the house, two strange men were sitting on horses by the stable. They were talking to Pa. They were as red-brown as Indians, but their eyes were narrow slits between squinting eyelids. They wore flaps of leather over their legs and spurs and wide-brimmed hats. Handkerchiefs were knotted around their necks, and pistols were on their hips. They said, "So long," to Pa, and "Hi, yip," to their horses, and they galloped away. "Well, here's a piece of luck," Pa said to Ma. "Those men are cowboys." They wanted Pa to help them keep the cattle out of the ravines among the bluffs of the creek bottoms. Pa would not charge them any money, but he told them he would take a piece of beef. "How would you like a good piece of beef?" Pa asked. "Oh, Charles," Ma said. Her eyes shone. Pa tied his biggest handkerchief around his neck. He showed Laura how he could pull it up over his mouth and nose to keep the dust out. Then he rode Patty west along the Indian Trail, till Laura and Mary couldn't see him anymore. All day the hot sun blazed and the hot winds blew, and the sound of the cattle herds came nearer. It was a faint, mournful sound of cattle lowing. At noon, dust was blowing along the horizon. Ma said that so many cattle trampled the grasses flat and stirred up dust from the prairie. Pa came riding home at sunset, covered with dust. There was dust in his beard and in his hair and on the rims of his eyelids. Dust fell off his clothes. He did not bring any beef because the cattle were not across the creek yet. The cattle went very slowly, eating grass as they went. They had to eat enough grass to be fat when they came to the cities where the people ate them. Pa did not talk much that night. He didn't play the fiddle. He went to bed soon after supper. The herds were so near now that Laura could hear them plainly. The mournful lowing sounded over the prairie till the night was dark. Then the cattle were quieter, and the cowboys began to sing. The songs were not like lullabies. They were high, lonely, wailing songs, almost like the howling of wolves. Laura lay awake, listening to the lonely songs wandering in the night. Farther away, real wolves howled. Sometimes the cattle lowed, but the cowboys' songs went on, rising and falling and wailing under the moon. When everyone else was asleep, Laura stole softly to the window, and she saw 3 fires gleaming like red eyes from the dark edge of the land. Overhead, the sky was big and still and full of moonlight. The lonely songs seemed to be crying for the moon. They made Laura's throat ache. All the next day, Laura and Mary watched the west. They could hear the faraway bawling of the cattle. They could see the dust blowing. Sometimes they thinly heard a shrill yell. Excuse me, my throat's dry. Suddenly, a dozen longhorn cattle burst out of the prairie, not far from the stable. They had come up out of the draw down to the creek bottoms. The tails stood up and their fierce horns tossed and their feet pounded the ground. A cowboy on a spotted Mustang galloped madly to get in front of them. He waved his big hat and yelled sharp, high yells. Yee! The cattle wheeled, clashing their horns together. With lifted tails, they galloped, lumbering away, and behind them the Mustang ran and whirled and ran, herding them together. They all went over a rise of the ground and down out of sight. Laura ran back and forth, waving her sunbonnet and yelling, "Hi, yee!" till Ma told her to stop. It was not ladylike to yell like that. Laura wished she could be a cowboy. Late that afternoon, 3 riders came out of the west, driving one lone cow. One of the riders was Pa, on Patty. Slowly, they came nearer, and Laura saw that with the cow was a little spotted calf. The cow came lunging and plunging. 2 cowboys rode well apart in front of her. 2 ropes around her long horns were fastened to the cowboys' saddles. When the cow lunged with her horns toward either cowboy, the other cowboy's pony braced its feet and held. The cow bawled, and the little calf bleated thinner balls. Ma watched from the window while Mary and Laura stood against the house and stared. The cowboys held the cow with their ropes while Pa tied her to the stable. Then they said goodbye to him and rode away. Ma could not believe that Pa had actually brought home a cow. But it was really their own cow. The calf was too small to travel, Pa said, and the cow would be too thin to sell. So the cowboys had given them to Pa. They had given him beef, too. A big chunk was tied to his saddle horn. Pa and Ma and Mary and Laura and even baby Carrie laughed for joy. Pa always laughed out loud, and his laugh was like big bells ringing. When Ma was pleased, she smiled a gentle smile that made Laura feel warm all over. But now she was laughing because they had a cow. "Give me a bucket, Caroline," Pa said. He was going to milk the cow right away. He took the bucket, he pushed back his hat, and he squatted by the cow to milk her. And that cow hunched herself up and kicked Pa flat on his back. Pa jumped up, his face blazing red and his eyes snapped blue sparks. "Now by the great horn spoon, I'll milk her," he said. He got his axe and sharpened 2 stout slabs of oak. He pushed the cow against the stable wall, and he drove those 2 slabs deep into the ground beside her. The cow bawled and the calf squalled. Pa tied poles firmly to the posts and stuck their ends into the cracks of the stable to make a fence. Now the cow could not move forward or backward or sideways, but the little calf could nudge its way in between its mother and the stable. So the baby calf felt safe and stopped bawling. It stood on that side of the cow and drank its supper, and Pa put his hand through the fence and milked from the other side. He got a tin cup almost full of milk. "We'll try again in the morning," he said. "The poor thing's as wild as a deer, but we'll gentle her. The dark was coming on. Nighthawks were chasing insects in the night air. Bullfrogs were croaking in the creek bottoms. A bird called, "Whip, whip, whippoorwill." "Hoo, hoo, hoo," called an owl. Far away the wolves howled and Jack was growling. "The wolves are following the herds," Pa said. "Tomorrow I'll build a strong, high yard for the cow that the wolves can't get into." So they all went into the house with the beef. Pa and Ma and Mary and Laura all agreed to give the milk to baby Carrie. They watched her drink it. The tin cup hid her face, but Laura could see the gulps of milk going down her throat. Gulp by gulp, she swallowed all that good milk. Then she licked the foam from her lip with her little red tongue and laughed. It seemed a long time before the cornbread and the sibling beefsteaks were done, but nothing had ever tasted so good as that tough, stringy, juicy beef. And everyone was happy because now there would be milk to drink and perhaps even butter for the cornbread. The lowing of the cattle herds far away again, and the sounds of the cowboys were almost too faint to be heard. All those cattle were on the other side of the creek bottoms now in Kansas. Tomorrow they would slowly go farther on their long way northward to Fort Dodge, where the soldiers were. Next week, Indian camp. Well, Alexis, these books are all on a playlist, so you don't have to, put up with me reading them live. Like the live is just for us, right? For us to come and enjoy. But if you actually want an uninterrupted chapter, you might want to look at the playlist of this book, right? So, I gotta go. I gotta start dinner. It's 4:30, and if I whip on it fast, it'll be 6:30 by the time I'm done. Oh, I didn't plug in my camera. Yes, I did. So, this is Bev from Reading with Beverly Wolfe, And like I said, there's not a whole lot to discuss. Oh, and why was the beef tough and stringy? Because it didn't hang. Fresh meat, if you take it right from the animal to the supper table, it's going to be tough as hell because the meat hasn't had time to relax. That's why you hang animals for a certain length of time after they have been killed, not just to bleed, but to relax the meat. All right. This is Bev from Reading with Beverly Wolfe, and I'll see you 4 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time next Saturday. Take care. God bless. And stay safe.